Boeing aims to shut down, quote, shadow factories.
So Boeing, yesterday the news, and it hit the Dow yesterday, and the news is the summer, perhaps, before we see the
very disappointing company. This is one of the great companies of the world, let's say, as of a year ago, and then all of a sudden things happened. I am so disappointed about it. Had a tremendous impact. You know, when you talk about growth, it's so big that some people say it's more than a half a point of GDP. So Boeing, big disappointment to me. Big disappointment.
Frankly, that Boeing once again caught in the middle of all of this. And for Boeing, you know, China used to be one of its most important foreign markets as far as the billions of dollars worth of commercial aircraft it could sell into the country. And of late, over the last several years, it's been enormously difficult. And
I will say that 80% of the airplanes we deliver, the commercial airplanes we deliver, are outside of the United States. So free trade is very important to us. And 80% of the content of those airplanes, it comes out of the United States. So we really are the ideal kind of an export company where we're outselling internationally. It's creating U.S. jobs, long-term, high-value U.S. jobs. So it's important that we continue to have access to that market and that we don't get in a situation where certain markets become closed to us.
Boeing just dropped a bomb on the U.S. economy, the $814.5 billion aviation industry, on life support. And it all traces back to one bold move, fueled by Trump's trade war and years of political chaos.
China is refusing to negotiate with President Trump on U.S. tariffs. In fact, the nation is taking the trade war to a new height. China is refusing to accept deliveries of Boeing jets.
Here's what went down. Boeing, the backbone of the U.S. aviation industry, the company that once defined the phrase "Made in America," has decided to move major portions of its production overseas.
And so now we have a situation where, due to political pressure and probably some lack of training, we've had 2 crashes. And now Boeing has to, the FAA has to burden that effort and try and figure out how do we get back to where we started from.
The ripple effects, catastrophic. Tens of thousands of jobs erased, entire communities destabilized, and the symbolic collapse of an $814.5 billion industry that once made America the world's leader in flight.
No, Preston, there's still a lot of questions about how many workers here in Washington will be impacted, as well as what jobs will be cut. But I did get a chance to speak with 3 workers who tell me that they are worried that their future is unknown.
And believe it or not, it all traces back to the trade war.
Shots have been fired in what could turn into an all-out trade war with China.
Not a war fought with soldiers, but with tariffs, tweets, and short-term political theater. To understand how we got here and how the most iconic aerospace company in America ended up moving overseas, we need to go back to 2018. That's when the so-called America First doctrine became a full-blown economic war. Let's rewind to March 2018. That's when President Donald Trump officially lit the fuse on what would become one of the most expensive economic experiments in American history. Using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, he slapped a 25% tariff on imported steel and 10% on aluminum, citing national security.
And people are starting to realize how important it is. We have to protect and build our steel and aluminum industries, while at the same time showing great flexibility and cooperation toward those that are really friends of ours, both on a trade basis and a military basis. A strong steel and aluminum industry are vital to our national security, absolutely vital. Steel is steel. You don't have steel, you don't have a country. Our industries have been targeted for years and years, decades in fact, by unfair foreign trade practices leading to the shuttered plants and mills, the laying off of millions of workers, and the decimation of entire communities. And that's going to stop, right? It's going to stop. This is not merely an economic disaster, but it's a security disaster. We want to build our ships, we want to build our planes, we want to build our military equipment with steel, with aluminum from our country. And now we're finally taking action to correct this long overdue problem. It's a travesty. Today, I'm defending America's national security by placing tariffs on foreign imports of steel and aluminum. We will have a 25% tariff on foreign steel and a 10% tariff on foreign aluminum when the product comes across our borders. It's a process called dumping, and they dump.
On paper, it sounded patriotic. In reality, it blew a hole through the heart of American manufacturing. For companies like Boeing, who rely on specialty metals from around the globe, costs soared. Suddenly, building a 737 wasn't just hard, it was cripplingly expensive. By July 2018, things escalated fast. The White House imposed 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, prompting Beijing to retaliate immediately with equal tariffs, targeting everything from soybeans to cars, and most notably, aircraft.
These tariffs are going to be raising prices for American companies that import products from China. As you might know, China is kind of a factory to the world, so there are many supply chains that run through that country. The Trump administration has decided to focus its tariffs not on the kind of consumer goods that you often see in Walmart, things like clothing, shoes, and televisions, but instead to focus on intermediate goods, the type that are used in factories in the United States to make other products. So actually it's going to raise prices for a lot of small and medium-sized manufacturers, especially. Retaliation is going to be hitting a variety of industries, including farm country. And so those are two big bases of support for the president that are going to be paying for these tariffs.
Yes, I said aircrafts. Consequently, Boeing was now in the crosshairs.
You know that the one concern that is out there, the big concern that's out there for this industry, is trade tensions, and whether or not that either prompts some airlines or some customers to say, I'm going to cool it on my orders, or potentially shift orders, whether it's from you guys to Airbus or Airbus to you guys, whatever it might be. Are you worried about the fact that this continues to simmer and that we're not sure where it's going to go?
Well, we are concerned. It's clear that the aerospace marketplace thrives on free and open trade around the world. And we're concerned about some of the talk of tariffs and trade restrictions. We're hopeful we'll find alternative solutions. We know that aerospace is good for economies around the world. So you take a look at the U.S.-China trade relationship, for example. Aerospace is great for growing the economy in China and creating the lift that they need. It's also U.S. manufacturing jobs, and it's creating economic growth here in the U.S.
Along those lines, we've heard from some airline CEOs who have said, look, while this is primarily a trade dispute about manufacturing in different sectors, whatever it might be, they're worried that this starts to hurt demand in terms of travel between continents. Are you getting any sense in the industry that that's a possibility?
Yeah, we haven't seen any pullback there, but that is the broader concern, because we know aerospace thrives in this broad global ecosystem. And the fact that the world is globally connected and frankly enabled by aerospace, whether it's travel of people or movement of goods around the world, it's really important that we have that healthy trade connection and free and open channels throughout the world. As aerospace grows, it grows jobs around the world. It's one of those things that creates real win-win solutions across countries.
In September 2018, another round, $200 billion more in Chinese imports, faced tariffs. China responded with another $60 billion in U.S. goods, escalating what was no longer a spat, but an all-out trade war. The next year, 2019, was when the bleeding turned visible. Chinese airlines drastically scaled back their Boeing orders. Beijing gave aggressive incentives to its own aircraft maker, Comac. And Airbus, they raked in new contracts that once would have gone straight to Seattle.
Our coding centers are next to the final assembly lines, so in China, Tianjin, in Alabama, USA, in Hamburg, Germany, and in Colomiers, Toulouse, France. This way, the final assembly line doesn't have to suffer any burden.
This is the Airbus A321 XLR, the youngest in its family. It has a nose from France, a body from Germany. The wings come from Wales. The rear stabilizer comes from Spain. Avionics come from America. When it comes to engines, you have a choice. You can either go American or French American. It's up to you.
By early 2019, Trump doubled down, threatening tariffs on all remaining Chinese imports, over $300 billion worth.
What does this mean? Another $267 billion of Chinese tariffs ready to go? I mean, we were discussing it with David earlier, but this will take time. We're just not even done with the 200.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think there's an important big macro point to make here, and that is that it would take essentially the amount of imports covered to the totality of U.S. imports from China. We've been talking about hitting all of the trade with China there. This would be a huge escalation of things. We are in the final stages. We're hearing that over at the White House, over at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, they're working through the kind of final stages of nailing down the specifics of what they want to do with the $200 billion tranche that we've all been waiting for. We know that the president is eager to go ahead with those as soon as possible, but he's really dropped this bombshell on Air Force One today, saying that there's another $267 billion to go further. So, I mean, that is not going to help things.
The stock market wobbled, manufacturers panicked, and Boeing in particular warned that long-term global competitiveness was now at risk.
We know this much, that they are very worried about losing people. I think there is some concern because the economy is doing what it's doing, that if they were to lose some people, they would not necessarily be able to get them back easily.
Then came 2020, the so-called Phase 1 deal. Trump stood on the White House lawn and declared victory. China had pledged to buy an extra $200 billion in American goods over 2 years, including aircraft. But the pandemic hit just weeks later, and those promises crumbled. By late 2021, the U.S. Trade Representative admitted that China had only fulfilled 57% of its purchasing commitments. Boeing didn't see a rebound. Instead, it saw a continued decline in Chinese orders, forcing layoffs and slowing production.
For the first quarter, we have a loss of $1.70 a share from Boeing. That is slightly worse than the expectation of a loss of $1.61. Revenue just shy of expectations, coming in at $16.9 billion. So that's the revenue for the first quarter. Free cash flow negative $4.7 billion, and the cash balance, which is going to be crucial over the next several quarters, not only immediately, but as they start to borrow more, $15.5 billion. Several pieces of news. Let's run down each of these. Commercial airplane production rates are being slashed. We've forecasted this based on our conversations with sources. Boeing confirming that it's going to be cutting its 787 Dreamliner production essentially in half by 2022, going from 14 a month down to 7 per month. They'll immediately cut it down to 10 per month this year. The 777, 777X going from 5 per month down to 3 per month in 2021. And then the 737 MAX. Now, they're going to gradually ramp production later this year once it's ungrounded, if it's ungrounded as expected by the late summer. Then they go to 31 per month. That's the expectation for 2021. We are also expecting any minute now to hear a formal announcement from the company about payroll reductions, basically cutting employees by 10% across the company, though the bigger impact will be on the commercial airplane business. This will be a mix of voluntary and involuntary job cuts at Boeing. We'll get the exact details and a message from CEO Dave Calhoun shortly. A couple other notes, guys. The MAX, we talk every quarter about the cost. Additional cost of $1 billion for the 737 MAX because of a slower ramp up in production than expected. And then also the cost, the impact of shutting down the commercial business in late March and everything that goes with that, that has cost the company $1.37 billion. But again, guys, we're waiting on the specific details regarding the payroll and headcount reductions. Again, 10% company-wide is the expectation.
And now, 2025 is when we're witnessing the consequences in full color. Because if the first Trump administration ignited the trade war, his return in 2024 poured gasoline on the ashes. Boeing was already reeling, decimated by years of retaliatory tariffs, severed supply chains, and a vanishing Chinese market. But then came Trump's second term, and with it, a trade agenda that took even fewer prisoners. On day one, he made his intentions clear: Decoupling from China is back on the table. And this time, he didn't stop at rhetoric. By March 2024, the White House rolled out Tariff Surge 2.0, a sweeping expansion of the original trade war. It raised tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese imports, including critical aerospace components, electronics, and aluminum alloys, items that Boeing depends on to build its planes. But it didn't stop there. Trump also signed an executive order pushing national reindustrialization, forcing federal contracts to go only to firms using 100% U.S.-sourced materials.
Thank you, Caroline. On the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order, any documentation around that? Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m. tonight, so effectively tomorrow, yes. Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States. He believes China has to make a deal with the United States. It was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight, but the president believes that she and China want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get that started. And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
So China has to call first?
The Chinese want to make a deal, they just don't know how to do it, but the president will be implementing these 104% tariffs on China tonight.
Under what conditions might he consider lowering tariffs on China at this point?
It would be imprudent of me to tell you those conditions here from the podium. I do just want to point out one thing, that the president, everybody in Washington, whether they want to admit it or not, knows that this president is right when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade. In fact, Democrats have long said that the United States of America has been ripped off by the countries around the world. They just don't want to admit it now because it's President Trump who is saying that.
The target? Primarily China. The method? Slapping massive tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, material Boeing needs to build literally every single plane. At first it sounded patriotic. Protect American jobs, punish foreign cheaters, red, white, and blue all the way. But what actually happened was economic sabotage. The tariffs didn't just hit China, they hit American companies that relied on global supply chains to stay competitive. Boeing's supply lines stretched across dozens of countries, and suddenly, every nut, bolt, wing panel, and sensor became more expensive to import. Overnight, their cost margins exploded. For Boeing, already suffering from raw material shortages and delivery delays, it was a logistical nightmare. The cost of compliance, astronomical. The global supply chains they'd spent decades building were rendered useless overnight. By mid-2024, China retaliated hard.
The president, as I said from the podium just a few days ago when I was up here, would be gracious if China intends to make a deal with the United States. If China continues to retaliate, it's not good for China. The United States of America is the strongest, best economy in the world, as evidenced by the more than 75 countries who have called the administration immediately to cut good deals. So the president wants to do what's right for the American people. He wants to see fair trade practices around the globe, and that's his intention and his goal. The tariff rate on China remains where it was yesterday, at the 145% level. The president made it very clear when the United States is punched, he will punch back harder, and he hopes to make a deal that benefits the American worker and our companies that have been ripped off for far too long.
Okay, good morning. Look, none of this is a surprise. These latest tariffs are very much in the Chinese playbook. But what's very attention-getting to me is the fact that China is now saying it's not going to raise tariffs any higher, saying it has other weapons, almost making fun of the United States for raising the stakes, raising the numbers so high. Let me share with you some remarks we got late today from a government official here in Beijing who said that the United States is engaging in nothing more than a numbers game with no real economic significance, going on to say the United States is exposing itself as a participant in weaponizing tariffs, as a tool of bullying and coercion, turning itself into a joke. So that is the latest where China stands in this back and forth tit for tat. The other big headline of the day is that we are hearing from Chinese President Xi Jinping, really the first time since this whole trade war escalated to such a high level. The big headline is that he is saying China is not afraid.
They blacklisted Boeing from state airline procurement deals. In its place, Airbus and Comac swept in to fill the void. And they also warned others.
China is now warning other countries not to strike trade deals with the U.S. that would impact Chinese interests.
It is just the latest move in the increasingly bitter trade war between the U.S. and China.
Chinese aviation companies, once among Boeing's largest customers, now shut their doors completely.
What we are seeing is a broader cachet of companies being caught up in US President Donald Trump's trade war, in which at least Chinese goods, they're being imposed a tariff of up to 145%. Now, what we know this time is that the Chinese government has asked its carriers to stop taking delivery of Boeing aircraft in the meantime, and this extends to aircraft-related equipment and parts from US companies. Now, this order came last week, just as China retaliated on the US with tariffs of 125%. And for the airlines, it makes the economics of buying an aircraft more challenging. It doubles the cost, frankly. And we have heard these warnings from a number of airlines globally, from Delta to Ryanair recently, about the warnings of aircraft deliveries being delayed. But in this case, for China, given this rapidly evolving trade war dispute, we don't know yet if any of these positions would change in the next week or two or longer. We have seen, for example, Donald Trump's position on Apple iPhones, for example, change.
The double blow was devastating. Raw materials became unaffordable, global sales plummeted, and Boeing, already struggling after the 737 MAX crisis, found itself caught in the crossfire of a war it never asked for.
How significant for Boeing? How significant for Chinese aviation? What role do the two play with each other?
Well, it is extraordinary that two of the world's largest economies are facing off, and frankly, that Boeing once again caught in the middle of all of this. And for Boeing, China used to be one of its most important foreign markets as far as the billions of dollars worth of commercial aircraft it could sell into the country. And of late, over the last several years, it's been enormously difficult, and Boeing hasn't won a large aircraft order from a Chinese carrier for many years now. And it comes against the backdrop, frankly, of China trying to develop its own commercial aviation plane-making capabilities. And so it's increasingly being squeezed out in the Chinese market. And when you look at the growth prospects over the next 20 years, the fact that China is going to account for a fifth of all aircraft demand, it does remain to be seen what role Boeing has to play in the years to come. But clearly on something like this, with Chinese airlines being asked to stop taking delivery of Boeing aircraft, Boeing, it said, had declined to comment on this story.
And Trump wasn't making things any easier. He put all the blame on Boeing for not being able to cope.
No, I'm not happy with Boeing. It takes them a long time to do. Air Force One, we gave that contract out a long time ago. It was a fixed price contract, and I'm not happy with the fact that it's taken so long. We're looking at other alternatives because it's taken Boeing too long. They were supposed to be finished like years ago.
Yeah.
Years ago. Don't forget, I signed that contract during my term, and it was a very good contract. And I took like $1.6 billion off the price. And it was supposed to be done, quickly. Yeah. And it's a long time.
This wasn't a trade strategy. This was an economic IED. Trump's administration, meanwhile, celebrated the confrontation as a win for economic sovereignty. But for Boeing workers in Everett, Renton, Wichita, and Charleston, the reality was brutal. Instead of rebuilding American industry and spiking the stock market, the trade war actually dismantled it.
China is digging in. Americans are waking up to a whole new escalation in the global trade war. Beijing is hiking its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods today from 84% to 125%. And for the first time since this all started, we're actually hearing from the Chinese President Xi Jinping himself. Xi's saying that his nation is, quote unquote, not afraid. And and also warning, quote, there are no winners in a trade war, and going against the world will only lead to self-isolation. This after President Trump raised tariffs on Chinese goods even higher, 145% now, as we're all trying to keep track. The White House says they're waiting for China to pick up the phone. China says essentially the same thing about the United States. This very clearly showing what a tit for tat looks like, sending markets tumbling Thursday. Stock futures are right now up across the board. Let's see if they stay a beautiful thing today. But what is concerning investors a lot right at the moment, the US dollar falling to its weakest level against the euro in 3 years.
And nowhere was the damage more visible than inside Boeing's legendary Everett factory. This was the birthplace of the 747, the pride of Washington State, a place where engineers and welders spent decades working side by side, where fathers and sons built the American dream together, one aircraft at a time. Now, it's silent. Production lines are empty, shift calendars wiped clean, toolboxes untouched. The factory that once echoed with the sound of roaring engines and innovation now echoes with nothing at all.
Right? There is a big turnover rate, and so a lot of people won't stay there very long.
Boeing tried to weather the storm. They lobbied, they warned, they begged for exemptions, for clarity, for logic. But none came. Instead, they got more chaos, more tariffs, more pressure, more global customers turning to Airbus, their European competitor, as a safer, more stable alternative. Faced with rising costs, declining demand, and zero support from policymakers, Boeing made the call: shut it down, move it out. Shift critical operations abroad where labor is cheaper, materials aren't taxed into oblivion, and trade wars aren't waged with megaphones. And just like that, the unthinkable happened. A company once so intertwined with American identity made the choice to untangle itself from the very country it helped build. And the fallout, it's everywhere. Thousands of machinists, technicians, engineers, gone. Local businesses that depended on Boeing's workforce, gone.
I feel like layoffs would impact morale for anybody, on different levels. We're all concerned about our jobs, but, the best we can do is, push forward.
Small towns built around Boeing's ecosystem, hollowed out. Worse yet, there's the human toll. Families losing homes, kids pulled out of college.
Well, I have a 12-year career here. I'd love to finish it. But being in the vulnerable position that I'm in, then, it's something that is going to take a setback for sure.
Workers in their 50s, forced into early retirement with nothing but a severance check and a shattered sense of purpose.
We love the Boeing company. We just don't appreciate the people that are making short-term decisions that have destroyed some of the things that we hold dear. They have focused solely on stock price. And I know that's important, and profitability is important, but they have pushed principles that have undermined the safety and quality of our manufacturing system.
A recent FAA investigation found deep flaws in Boeing's quality control process. One of its plane lines has been grounded.
All because of a trade war that promised strength, but delivered carnage. And let's not forget, this isn't just about passenger planes. Boeing is a key defense contractor. They build refueling tankers, spy planes, and military transports.
You used to run the defense division at Boeing. How does this market right now compare to where we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years? Do you expect to see greater growth in that area as far as budgets being allocated in that area?
Yeah, we're seeing an upswing in the defense market, not only in strengthening of the U.S. defense budget, but also in our allies around the world. About a third of our defense business today is outside of the U.S., so that's a continuing growing segment for us. But we're seeing strength in the defense market writ large, and it spans our rotorcraft lines, satellites, fighter aircraft, commercial derivatives, tankers, mobility assets. And I think as you see the growing commercial industry around the world, the fact that defense is growing at the same time, at Boeing we see a lot of synergy between the two.
When production moves overseas, so does critical infrastructure. That's not just an economic liability, it's a national security risk. We are now outsourcing not just our jobs, but our military readiness, our technological edge, our strategic advantage. And the worst part? This didn't have to happen. If the trade war had been strategic, calculated, and collaborative, Boeing could have been shielded, strengthened, given room to adapt. Instead, it became collateral damage in a political stunt dressed up as policy. Boeing's decision isn't just a business move. It's a red flag waving wildly over a broken system. A warning to every American industry: if you build here and the government ties your hands with reckless tariffs, don't expect loyalty to be enough, because even the most iconic companies can be pushed too far. So now the question isn't what went wrong, it's who's next. If Boeing can be sacrificed on the altar of political ego, no industry is safe. So hit subscribe if you believe it's time to stop playing economic roulette with American jobs. Drop a comment below. Was this bold leadership or a national betrayal? And share this video because the media won't say it, but the fall of Boeing is the fall of American dominance.